Okay, so tonight we are welcoming Dr. Thomas Dietz. He is a professor of sociology and environmental science at Michigan State University. He is also co-director of the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment Center. He holds a PhD in ecology from the University of California, Davis. At Michigan State, he was the founding director of the Environmental Science and Policy Program. And among his many honors, Dr. Dietz is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and has been awarded the Sustainability Science Award of the Ecological Society of America. At the National Research Council, he has served as the chair of the U.S. National Research Council's Committee on Human Dimensions of Global Change, and also as the vice chair of the panel of Advancing the Science of Climate Change of America's Climate Choices. In this latter role, he briefed the President's Science Advisor and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy on climate change science. He is currently a member of the NRC Committee to advise the U.S. Global Change Research Program and has authored or co-authored 13 books and more than 150 papers and book chapters. His current research examines the human driving forces of environmental change, environmental values, and the interplay between science and democracy in environmental issues. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Dietz.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to try to project to the back, so can everybody hear me in the back okay? Was that louder or okay? Okay, good. It's wonderful to be here. As I mentioned last night, it's a lot of fun to talk to a community that's sort of centered around ecology, because that's my own intellectual center. And these have been some of the most interesting conversations that I've had in quite a while over the last day and a half, 2 days now. And it's a cool day. This is the second most excited I've been about the award of a Nobel Prize in my life. If you haven't heard, Bob Dylan was given the Nobel Prize in Literature. And that, when I first saw that on the web, I thought, oh, that's a joke. But it's not. So I'm kind of excited about that. The first most excited, as some of you will know, is when Lynn Ostrom won the Nobel Prize, the first and only woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And Lynn was a collaborator of mine and one of the most amazing scientists and most amazing human beings I've ever met. So Dylan is great, but Lynn winning was better. But still, I can't complain. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of my own research. Unlike last night, there will be numbers. But I also want to frame this in sort of a more general sense of where I see this fitting into human ecology, because as I've learned, this is an audience that has some people who do what I would consider to be human ecology, but others who do other forms of ecology, and I want to kind of lay out sort of the context in which I see human ecology and how it relates to the larger field of ecology. So I do three kinds of things in my work. I do work on environmental decision making, which gets down to what are the influences of values, beliefs, norms, trust, and other social psychological factors on individual decision making. And a lot of this is encapsulated in something called values, beliefs, norms theory, or VBN theory. And it, as I'll mention, it relates to ecology in that the central theme in this work is the scope of altruism versus self-interest, which is, of course, a central theme in evolutionary theory. And I'm very much influenced by thinking about evolutionary theory. If you heard the talk yesterday, I talked a good bit about science and deliberative processes. So how do we meld science and public deliberation for decision makings in a democracy? And what I'm going to talk about today has come to be called structural human ecology. What are the drivers of anthropogenic environmental change and the drivers of human well-being? And again, last night I talked about when I think about sustainability, I think a useful way to think about sustainability as increasing human well-being while reducing the damage we do to the environment. And so this is the empirical work that's kind of the subject of what I want to talk about. I also want to spend a moment sort of framing how I think about doing science. So there's this old distinction between pure science and applied science, or this spectrum of science that runs from pure to applied. And that idea actually came out of a science advisor, Vannevar Bush, right after World War II, who said the nation should invest in science in order to advance the nation in terms of national defense and economic growth and things like that. And there is this spectrum, and we have to pick at what points along that spectrum various agencies invest. But for those of us who work on environment, I don't think that's a very useful way to think about things. And I'm drawn to what's called Pasteur's Quadrant by Donald Stokes, a book published now 20 years ago. And he said there are two questions you can ask of any piece of research or any research program. Is it useful? Is it going to produce results that will be of use to people? And does it contribute to fundamental understanding? And what Stokes argued is that if you don't care about use but you care about fundamental understanding, an example of that is Niels Bohr, the quantum theorist, who really didn't care much about cared about fundamental understanding, didn't care about contributing to use. And you can have Edison's quadrant where Edison invented a research. Edison gets credit for a lot of inventions, but it's not clear that he invented many of them. What he invented was a way to get people to invent things in his shop. And so that's Edison's quadrant. And I've added, this is not Stokes, the disciplinary wind and stakeholder gravity. So why aren't we up in that upper right-hand quadrant where we're contributing to both fundamental understanding and we're doing stuff that's useful? And I would argue that we do face certain kinds of pressures from disciplines and from stakeholders that pull us away from that. And certainly in a land-grant institution, many of you will be familiar with those kinds of things. But Stokes's point was there's Louis Pasteur, who more or less invented the science of microbiology while doing research that improved human health and not quite as important, but still important, led to better wine and cheese. And so that's Pasteur's quadrant. And I put in there two friends of mine, unfortunately both passed away. Lynn Ostrom, who I mentioned before, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on the Commons, and Ed Miles, who was a political scientist at University of Washington, who was very influential in thinking about how we can take information about climate change and make it useful for decision makers. So I think we can occupy that quadrant, but it takes a struggle to get there. So human ecology, I'm associated with a language called coupled human and natural systems, or CHANS, and that's just one term of art for what I actually prefer to call human ecology. I want to point out that there's a long tradition with a lot of names. There was good work in what I would consider to be human ecology going on certainly in the 1960s and well before that, particularly in anthropology. And this notion of looking at humans and their interactions with the environment, and by environment I mean the biophysical environment, not the social environment, is a venerable tradition. It's gone by lots of names. So there's CHANS, there's the second environmental science, there's coupled human and environmental systems, and so on. Unfortunately, the term human ecology has been twice used by subgroups that don't mean what I mean and what I think we would mean by it. So within sociology, even though human ecology started off dealing with humans and their environment in the sense that we might mean it, a prominent theorist, Amos Hawley, in the 80s or 90s said that we really should ignore the biophysical environment in sociology, in human ecology. It's all about human structures influencing humans. And home economics, as some of you know, changed its name. At least some departments or colleges of home economics changed their name to human ecology in, I guess that was also in the 80s. That happened at Michigan State. Cornell was the kind of leader of that. I think that's kind of fading away. So I'm kind of anxious to reclaim the term human ecology. When I came to Michigan State, I couldn't say to people, I do human ecology, because they would have assumed that I was somebody affiliated with the College of Human Ecology, which had been the College of Home Economics. And the people in the College of Home Economics, or in the College of Human Ecology, were doing wonderful work. It's just not what I do. So now that we don't have a College of Human Ecology anymore at Michigan State, or a College of Home Economics, that stuff has been reorganized. And so I'm reclaiming the term. What are the key features of it, and particularly this version that's called structural human ecology that I've been associated with? The approach I use emphasizes individual decision-making, it's supposed to be under, not uncertainty, but with the understanding that people's decisions are always constrained by their context, but also that the decisions they make shape the context. So this is a very Darwinian approach. I mean, this is to me the fundamental contribution of Darwinian. Evolution through natural selection was important, but what Ernst Mayr calls population thinking is in some ways an even more fundamental contribution, and that fundamentally informs my thinking. To paraphrase G. Evelyn Hutchinson, I think what we're up to is looking at the cultural evolutionary play in the human ecological theater, but the difference between this approach and Hutchinson's The Evolutionary Play in the Ecological Theater, which is the title of one of his books, one of his collection of essays, is that we also have to be aware that humans rearrange the set as we go along in the play. And also in the field now, there's a strong emphasis of telecoupling, that is, coupling over distance, non-adjacency, of physical, biological, and social systems. So that's part of kind of what's going on in what I think of as human ecology. So will I get this? Oh, good. This is a time when there are a lot of openings for human ecology, and a lot of it is due to the broad-minded thinking of the Ecological Society of America, in fact. But I like to point out that both ecology and the social sciences are historical evolutionary sciences. We don't have strong invariance principles. We have some general principles, but we understand that we have to understand the contexts in which those play out. That there's a theory of island biogeography, for example, but you've got to think through your specific ecosystem and its characteristics before you can actually do something useful with those kinds of theories. As opposed to, say, physics, where you can be pretty sure that if we run the inclined plane experiment, running the Galileo experiment, run a couple of different balls down an inclined plane, and we do it here, given difference in the gravitational constant, we'd get the same result if we did it on the moon, and we'd get the same result if we did it 10,000 years ago, and the same result if we did it 10,000 years from now. Whether you're a social scientist or an ecologist, you've got to be cautious about that. You wouldn't necessarily assume that's true because the context changed. The ESA has opened up a lot of space for human ecology. I've learned today that I haven't even half captured some of the sections in ESA that are open to social science work. ESA has acknowledged that nearly all ecosystems are human influenced. We have the NSF long-term ecological research networks, which have been on a move with a stumble towards incorporating more social science, more human dimensions work into them. The Advancing the Science of Climate Change report, of which I was the vice chair, made a strong point to the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is the coordinating group of federal agencies that funds about $2 billion a year. It's actually a bit up from that, of climate change research across all the federal agencies, that social science needed to be central to what the GCRP funds. So we see a lot of signs that this is kind of moving forward, human ecology as a field. Let me give you just one example of the kind of work that's human ecology from my own work before I go on to presenting some new research results. The sort of master metaphor, again, is a cultural evolutionary play in the human ecological theater. So down here we have an adaptive landscape. And it's just a hypothetical adaptive landscape. It's not representing any real system. But the idea we have is that people will try to move from blue to red, the standard notion of adaptation, by using resources, where height indicates, say, well-being or short-term or fitness in the long term. But we also know for humans that by deploying power, which you can define as control over physical, natural, human, and social resources, individuals and group can actually change the shape of that landscape. So humans are actively constructing the environment that places selective pressure on them. Now, other species do that too, but it's a very important part of thinking through human ecology. Exogenous environmental change can also shift the adaptive landscape, but that's really no different than what happens with other species as well. There's this approach called an ecology of games, which also sort of looks at this in much the same way. So that's kind of the conceptual framework. Let me give you one example of research that's sort of in this tradition. I work with Jack Liu and his students and collaborators, and Jack has been doing long-term studies in the Wolong Panda Reserve, which is one of the major panda habitats in China. I've never been there, actually. But the major stress on the panda habit is the use of firewood as a natural resource, and the average consumption per household. This is in a very rural and remote area of China. The average consumption of firewood per household is 6,000 kilograms per year. When I first saw that number, Xiaodong Chen, who I was working with a graduate student, I said, this is off by an order of magnitude, right? And he said, no, it's cold there. People use a lot of firewood. So that's the basic, most important stressor on the panda habitat. The residents prefer to use electricity, which is available, but it's pretty expensive. And people don't have money because there's not that much of a cash economy out there. But jobs are available in distant cities. So that's kind of human capital. That if you have some skills, you can get a job, but the cities are basically at least a day's bus ride away. So people find jobs via weak ties in social networks. It's not necessarily their friends, but the friends of their friends who help them find jobs. The idea of weak ties is a very well-developed idea in sociology. So that's deploying a social resource to try to find a job that will get you money. So people use the money to displace the natural capital that they're using of firewood, but they get that natural capital by deploying human resources, labor, and they're able to do that because of social capital. So these notions of multiple capitals that I'll come back to, but different kinds of resources that people can use, are all sort of intertwined in terms of what's going on in Wolong. So we have a situation there where when we look at the households, we find that the households that are using less firewood are doing that because they're using electricity. And they're using the electricity because they have cash income. And for most of them, the cash income comes because some member of the household is off in some other city earning the cash. And so that whole chain takes pressure off the panda habitat. So that's the kind of adaptive complex that we identified in this paper. And then thinking through, well, what are the implications of that? How could we intervene to change the scape of this landscape? Because most people don't have access to the social resource of a network that allows somebody in the household to go and get a job for cash. So they don't have the opportunity to use the electricity. So while the government tries to subsidize the electricity, it's still quite expensive. And what the government hasn't done out in Wolong is to help people find jobs in the cities. So this was one of our policy recommendations, that if you really want to take pressure off the panda habitat, given this chain of actions, one of the things you could do is to set up some sort of little office in the community that would help people who want to go to the cities to get work to do that. Of course, you have to be careful here because the use of natural resources in the reserve, the wood, is being displaced when people use electricity to a hydroelectric dam. And that, of course, has environmental consequences too. So I don't want to paint this as entirely benign. So the point here is that various different kinds of resources and people's agency, their ability to deploy these in sort of smart ways to do things and have some power over the situation, are useful ways to frame the analysis. So this is just sort of an example of sort of the kind of human ecology that I think we need to do more. But I want to talk a little bit about challenges to doing this kind of work. So I talked last night about sort of transitions in human history. So humans became a dominant influence on some ecosystems maybe 50,000 years ago. They became a dominant force in the evolution on Earth with the spread of horticulture and agriculture about 5,000 years ago. The modern complex of capitalism and technology, the start of the Anthropocene, is 1750 or so. The great acceleration I talked about last night, where everything starts taking off like crazy, starts about 1950. The best time depth I have in any data analysis I've been able to do is from about 1960 on. So I'm not able, with any data I can get a hold on, to cover actually the whole scope of human cultural evolutionary history by any means. And I actually can't go very far back. So that's one of the constraints. We don't have the time series data we need. We also have the problem, whether we're working on ecosystems or in social systems, and certainly on the coupled systems, we've got these complicated nested systems. And the details don't matter. This is meant to be sort of a cartoon in the sense of a sketch of an idea rather than something you can use analytically. Those two boxes are in purple because that's where I happen to do most of my research. But we always have to realize that whatever we're studying is either made up of smaller units and or is the context in which smaller units operate. So individuals live in organizations and communities and political subdivisions and so on. So there are always these contextual effects. And that gets to the problem of levels of analysis and units for our theory. And this is an issue in ecology and evolutionary biology of when do you get functional integration of units larger than the individual. And there's a lot of evolutionary theory about this. But the basic idea is that if you have phenotypes where their behavior is dominated by the genotype, it's fairly hard to have functionally integrated cooperative groups. And the exceptions to that, as E.O. Wilson has pointed out, are where you have relatively unusual genetic systems. But when you have culture with its evolutionary processes and maybe epigenetics having a strong influence on the phenotypes, it's not so hard to get group selection acting. And if you have group selection, then you can get altruism and functional integration of larger units. And that leads to the kind of situation that I believe we have with humans. So my point about this is that the work I do, while it's not evolutionary theory per se, is actually motivated by questions that come out of evolutionary theory about when do you have self-interested behavior and when do you have altruistic behavior. When is it meaningful to think about action by an aggregate versus action by an individual? And the framing for all that, the way of thinking about all that, actually comes out of evolutionary theory. Okay. So what we end up doing is some work looks at environmental stressors and vulnerability at the individual, household, or community level. So there's a lot of research like that. I've done some of it on household energy consumption, but many geographers and anthropologists do this kind of work, as well as many sociologists. The strength of this kind of work is that you're working at the individual human level, so it's relatively easy to talk about agency and functional integration. It's easy and seems to be meaningful to say people make decisions to do this or that, given constraints. But the limits with this kind of work is it's difficult to make comparisons that allow us to understand the effect of the big things, the big structural things, institutions and cultures and so on. There's also a tradition in the social sciences of doing cross-national or other large-scale comparisons. The strength of that kind of work is it allows you to make comparisons of institutions, political institutions, policies, and other large-scale factors that's hard to get at with the individual level data. But the difficulty is that you got to be cautious about what you're saying behavior is at that level. So there are strengths and weaknesses of each of these levels. And I'll talk about the ideal way to do it, but the problem I'll identify is that we don't have data to do the ideal way usually. So we have to make these compromises. And I mentioned network analysis actually gives you a way of bridging some of these gaps. Okay, so here's the ideal method. What we would like to have to study, say, human stress on the environment, why is there human stress on the environment, is a set of nested probability samples. So we would start with individuals. Pete Vida would argue you start with people's actions that are environmentally consequential. But you aggregate through every level with significant emergent properties at each level. So you have a model at the individual level. So something I press here will be a pointer. Yeah. So you have a model at the individual level. And as I mentioned before, I do some of this, lots of people do this. So you're modeling some behavior that's environmentally consequential as a function of characteristics of the individual. But they live in a community. And the community has characteristics. So the way we usually model this is that we say that there are a set of characteristics of the community that influence this function that links individual characteristics to the behavior. And then we can go up many levels, but I'll just use as an example, we go to the national level, and the way we tend to model this is we'd say there are characteristics of the nation state, policies, institutions, and so on, that drive this function, which drives this function. So we have this hierarchical set of relationships. And of course, this is just hierarchical analysis in statistics. It's pretty straightforward. But conceptually, I think we don't have a problem dealing with these nested hierarchies. It's just that we don't usually have the data that allows this to happen. Okay, we do have some examples where we've been able to do this. Most of the research that's been done in the areas that I look at have to do with analyses of people's environmental concerns. So we have surveys, and they have good measures of environmental concern or views about climate change. They very seldom have behavior. They might have self-reported behavior or behavioral intentions. I'd be willing to do something. But that's a constraint on this. But we have those several kinds of data sets of that sort on environmental concern or climate change attitudes from many countries. And so then we've been able to do that hierarchical analysis. We have individual characteristics that affect the individual's level of concern. And then we have characteristics of countries that affects how the individual characteristics affect the individual's concern. And this is a list of some of the papers. I want to note that Jennifer, who is here somewhere, I always lose track of where you are, has written a whole series of these papers, and they're absolutely first rate. So this is really getting at sort of interesting things. How do these larger structural and institutional factors affect how the individuals are acting? But the problem, as Sherlock Holmes pointed out, is data. We have this for environmental attitudes. We have several banks of surveys that have done this in multiple countries. But for many of the things we want to study, we don't have this kind of data. So I think what we have to do is sort of a compromise, that we work with what we have, being attentive to the strengths and limits of each approach, and try to develop at the same time strategies to get the funding to have better data collection. And data as community resources is something that I feel very strongly about. Okay. So let me now get on to some empirical results. And again, you saw this slide last night. Probably much of what I'm going to say is wrong, and you've heard much of it before, but maybe it's useful to repeat it. So part of the work I do is looking at what drives environmental impacts or environmental stressors. And the venerable way to look at this is the so-called IPAD equation that emerged in a debate between Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren on the one hand and Barry Commoner on the other. John says that he and Paul invented it, but I think it really emerged from the debate. It wasn't an individual product. And this is around, and it's still very influential. If you look at you look at emission scenarios that drive climate models, and you dig really deep, what's in the emission scenarios is the Kaya identity, which is the IPAD equation with one more term for emissions per unit GDP in there. So this is still around. But the problem with it is that it's an accounting equation. It's true by definition. It has to balance. So what we did was to say, well, we can convert this into basically a regression model. And instead of assuming the effects of population affluence and other variables, we can estimate them with data and see what they are. So last night I was asked a question about is population the major variable? And I said, well, we know what the elasticities are across the whole series of studies. That comes from this kind of analysis. So instead of saying this is the effect of, assuming the effect of population growth, we get data and we estimate what the effects are. And you can translate the multiplicative model into a model that's linear in the logs. There's a lot of this kind of work that uses nation states as a unit of analysis, but also sub-regional analyses. There's a lot of stuff. There's in English. There's a whole literature in Chinese that I can't read that uses these STIRPAT models. And right now we have about 2,200 sites to the core papers that we've used that specifically use this kind of approach. So that's one line of research. But the next move was to model human well-being as a function of the use of resources, physical, natural, human, and social resources, and ask the question of how efficient are nations at producing well-being. I showed some slides yesterday that said, there is this corner that's kind of interesting. Maybe we can get to there. This is an attempt to actually begin to make conjectures and test hypotheses about how one gets into that corner. Let me go through these. You've seen these graphs before. I just want to point out that some of this logic was driven by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where the emphasis was on the relationship between human well-being and ecosystem services. The literature so far on what's come to be called the ecological intensity of well-being. So what's the ratio of human well-being to the amount of stress being placed on the environment as a way to capture this relationship, is that, first of all, placing stress on the environment beyond a certain minimum doesn't actually improve human well-being, net of other factors, that there's no environmental Kuznets curve for intensity of well-being. That is, as you get more affluent, things don't get all better, and that economic growth overall hasn't led to improvements in developing nations and has actually worsened the intensity. That is, you're getting more damage to the environment per unit well-being in the more affluent nations. Okay, so let me just quickly look at a local example. I'm building up to a more detailed analysis. This is looking at the relationship between use of ecosystem services and well-being in a particular case in Wolong. And these are the kind of data sets that had to be put together to do this suite of papers. So you can see why we need interdisciplinary collaboration. I mean, that no one person could possibly do all these things with high competence. And you also see that it was there it is. Jack Liu has been working in Wolong and the adjacent communities for almost 20 years. And so we have this nice time series of data of household surveys, but other things as well, that he's been collecting that allows for some very powerful analysis because he's made the investment of actually making sure we have data over time. So Wu Yang, one of the folks in Jack's shop that I work with, and I know you can't read that, but he basically looked at the categories of ecosystem services that are defined in the Millennium Assessment of Ecosystem Services, and then used household survey data in the Wolong Panda Reserve to try to assess for each household in the sample what kinds of ecosystem services were they using. And this is the sort of long table from the PLOS paper of exactly how that's done. But the basic idea is let's go out and measure what households are actually using in terms of ecosystem services, and then also look at the well-being of the households. And one of the things we have done with this is to look at the impacts of the Wenchuan earthquake. So that's the epicenter. This is the Panda Reserve. That's the epicenter of the earthquake. Actually, this is the Panda Reserve, and that's the epicenter of the earthquake. And it was nasty. Was over 69,000 deaths from the earthquake overall. Huge damages. 1.5 million people had to be resettled because of the earthquake. There was massive damage to the roads and the road system right around the Panda Reserve. But it was less severe down in Shanjiang Township. And you can see the numbers there. So we had data pre and post earthquake from both within the reserve, the households within the reserve, and from, if you will, this control community, which is Shanjiang Township. And what we did was to look at how did the earthquake affect the use of ecosystem services, and how did ecosystem services relate to human well-being pre and post earthquake. And what you see is a whopping big impact on provisioning services. So that's basically stuff like growing food. And cultural services are the use of the ecosystem for sort of recreational purposes and things like that. And there was a significant effect here. But what we found that I think is more interesting, but hard to put into a single graph, is the households that had the most variation, most diversity in the kinds of ecosystem services they used were much less vulnerable to the adverse effects of the earthquake. I should mention that the earthquake not only caused damage and death directly, but it destroyed a lot of the roads that brought in the tourism for Wolong. So diversifying the types of ecosystem services used led to more resilience. Disadvantaged households, not surprisingly, suffered more. And while these findings are interesting in themselves, I think it's mostly, this paper is useful for proof of concept because it shows that we can use surveys to actually measure use of ecosystem services and well-being. And if we collect that data systematically over time, we can begin to capture some of the effects of things like the Wolong earthquake, but also changes in policy and other things. And Wu has done a number of papers that get at those sorts of things too. Okay, so now I want to actually get to some empirical results. So I mentioned, again, the STIRPAT model, which is this multiplicative regression that captures the logic of the IPAT model. And what we want to do is to look at U.S. states and greenhouse gas emissions as our measure of environmental stress. And we want to look at population and affluence and those sorts of drivers, but we also want to bring in politics or power and social movements, sociological concepts, to see if they are influential in greenhouse gas emissions. So this is kind of the conceptual structure of the model, that we have environmental stress, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions. And the sort of immediate driver that we always think about is, well, this is the scale of production and consumption. I should have left E out of there because it's easier to explain without the error term in there. But this is sort of the scale, the population times the per capita affluence. And in each U.S. state, there are a whole bunch of regulations, policies, standards, norms, et cetera, that affect how population and affluence affect greenhouse gas emissions. And we actually don't measure these. What we do look at is a couple of kinds of social structural factors, institutions, distributions of power, et cetera, that are sort of surrogates for these. So this is sort of a reduced form model. And we argue that they may have direct effects here, but what they're basically doing is changing how population and affluence influence environmental stress. So that's kind of the logic of the model. You don't need to be, for sociologists, I have to explain why greenhouse gas emissions. In sociology, and I'll kind of go over this fairly quickly, there are sort of two dominant theories of what drives environmental stress. There's treadmill of production theory, which is attributed primarily to Alan Schneeberg, but has had lots of sort of further work, that argues that in the United States and in most capitalist countries, you have to have economic growth for political reasons. It's essential. You can't maintain the political stability without economic growth. And historically in the U.S. since World War II, workers through unions have made strong demands for a share of that growth. So the environment, which up until 1970 or so didn't have very many strong advocates, was the place where you extracted surplus, to use the Marxist term. It's the thing that gets hammered in order to have economic growth and give part of that growth to workers to maintain peace between labor and capital. That's Schneeberg's argument. But the basic idea of treadmill of production is that the societies we live in depend on growth, and if you're going to keep growing, you're going to keep damaging the environment. Okay? And that there are economic reasons to ignore that damage. Okay. Contra that is a series of theories in sociology, ecological modernization theory, in political science, post-materialist theory, in economics, environmental Kuznets theory, that argue that as societies start to get affluent, they do in fact start doing more and more damage to the environment. But when a certain level of affluence is reached, people begin to care about the environment, and it levels off and then goes down. So it's a U-shaped, inverted U-shaped curve, sort of like a normal distribution. And so these are sort of conflicting theories. One says it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and the other says it's going to get worse for a while and then it'll start to get better because of political reform, basically. Okay, these are more details. I'll skip over that. So this is the basic idea of ecological modernization theory or environmental Kuznets theory or post-materialist theory. There's slight nuances, difference between these, but it's basically the same argument that as you get more and more and more affluent, it gets worse and worse, but then there's a turning point and then things get better. Versus, should have put that on here as well, versus treadmill of production theory, which is it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. Okay. I would summarize, there's zillions of papers published on comparing these theories. Ecological modernization approach, I think, has established that some firms, industries, and nations do undertake programs that effectively reduce environmental impact. But there's also evidence that if you look at pollution that has local impacts, that last curve does seem to apply. As we look across nations or other units, air and water pollution, for example, tend to get worse and worse and worse, and then they reach a certain level of affluence, and then things get better and better. But if you look at global problems like greenhouse gas emissions, there's no evidence for the environmental Kuznets curve. And so those statements I just made are summarizing 4 or 5 dozen papers that have looked at this stuff empirically. Okay, so Rachel Schwamm, who is at Rutgers in human ecology, Rutgers has a department of human ecology that is not home economics, but is what we think of as human ecology, published a paper that said both of these things are right, but it depends on the context. That what you have is a struggle over politics in a country, the U.S. is her example, and at times folks who want to have unfettered growth and don't pay much attention to the environment are in ascendancy, and that's the kind of policies you get. And at other times, people who have concern with the environment and want to moderate the effects of economic growth have power, and so you get policies put into place that are consistent with the arguments of ecological modernization theory that will tend to tap down those effects. And when you look at this in the U.S., of course, it's important to remember that there's an active movement, what my colleague Aaron McWright has labeled anti-reflexivity, to sort of stop us from paying attention to environmental problems. Reflexivity is the argument that the ecological modernization theorists make, that as society goes along, we begin to realize and reflect upon or reflexive about the environmental problems we're creating, and therefore we come to reforms. Okay, so what Rachel would say, Schwamm would say, is that, that This is an attempt to move us into treadmill of production, and to the extent that this movement is successful, we'll get a sort of treadmill of production argument, but to the extent that the forces of environmentalism are successful, we'll get those reforms and see reduced impacts. Okay. Oops. Yeah, and I think I'll skip over this. It's just making the case of why do this analysis at the level of U.S. states. And the main reason is that states are important geopolitical units in environmental regulation, that this is where a lot of the action happens. And so what we want to do is to build one of these STIRPAT models for emission of greenhouse gas emissions by states. And we want to look at the factors that influence that. So for scale, we look at population and gross product per state. And we add a quadratic term to get for gross product per state to get this turnover effect in the model, if that happens. We allow for it as a possibility. And we also added the proportion of the labor force employed, so what proportion of people are actually working in jobs, as another measure of the scale of the economy of the state. So all three of these variables are trying to get at scale, which we see as the basic driver of greenhouse gas emissions. And then we want to look at measures of political power for various groups with the argument that that might moderate the effects of scale through a bunch of policies and things that will vary from state to state and would be very hard to compare across states. So that's kind of the latent or hidden variable in the middle that we don't directly measure. So we looked at environmentalism, the strength of the environmental movement, roughly speaking, by looking at a score the League of Conservation Voters have developed. So the LCV gets a bunch of experts on environmental policy, and they look at the votes in every Congress, and they pick typically about 10, and they say these are the most important environmental votes in this Congress. And then they score every member of the House and the Senate on the proportion of times that they voted pro-environmental. And this is not unique to League of Conservation Voters, that there are many, many liberal and conservative groups that do exactly this kind of thing. They pick a list of votes that occurred in Congress and then score each member based on this. So it's a pretty well-established approach. There are also in political science a number of measures of the liberal-conservative spectrum for each state. And I won't go into the details of those, but this is picking up on the degree to which power in the state is in the hands of liberals or conservatives. There's an argument in ecofeminist theory that says women will take better care of the environment than men will. And this certainly is the case when you look at survey data, for example. And we use just a simple measure of the proportion of legislators who are women in the state. We actually tried to do the same thing with African Americans and Hispanics, but it turns out that there aren't systematic data collection for the state legislators, so we couldn't go far enough back in the time series to look at that. And there have been a lot of arguments back and forth about the role of unions in environmental reform, so we don't have sort of a prediction as to what the sign on that coefficient would be, but we included the percent of the labor force that was unionized just to see what it would do. State data from 1990 to 2005, so the sample size is about 100. This is what's called in the jargon panel data, repeated observations on the same units. So the usual way people do this, and this is used in ecology as well as in the social sciences, is a so-called fixed effects model. And the idea with a fixed effects model is that you are controlling for the characteristics of, in this case, each U.S. state that are constant over time, and you can do that even though you didn't measure them. And you can do this by first differences or by adding dummy variables. There are several ways to think about how you do it. But fixed effects is seen as powerful because it takes out the effect of variables that cause states to differ that you didn't measure. But the problem with that is that, and it is a very standard approach in the literature, but the problem with that is that you're then only looking at variation over time. You're throwing out the initial variation across states. And we didn't want to do that. There's an emerging literature that's saying, well, it might be useful to look at both. So we have a particular a way we do that in a multi-level model that, yeah, I guess I left that off the slide because it's a little complicated. But what we're basically doing here is two analyses that are nested in one another. One is we're doing an analysis that compares states at the starting year of 1990. So what things led states to be different from each other in 1990? And then as a second level of the model, what leads states then to vary, to change, each state to change over time. So the first level analysis is why are states different from one another in 1990? And then the second analysis is what causes a state to change over time. Okay. So again, this logic is to say that these measures of political power of different groups or different ideologies is influencing how population affluence and labor force participation influence greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you. So one of the things that when we presented this to some climate scientists is, oh, come on. Things like the votes in Congress that are not necessarily don't have anything to do necessarily with greenhouse gas effects can't possibly influence greenhouse gas emissions. This is sort of a bold sociological assertion that these political factors can actually affect greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what we're trying to get at here as a big point. We want to see if we can estimate the effects of these political factors on emissions. So these are the multi-level models. You can have the slides if you want to look at that. I think not a good use of time to go through all the equations. But I should just mention in passing for those of you who know panel analysis, the way we did this is with what's called adaptive centering. So we look at each state's values for a given year as the deviation of that state from the starting year, rather than analyzing the raw data. So it's one way of doing adaptive centering. And that gives you the same benefits as the fixed effects models, but also allows us to look at the differences in states in the starting period. And these are the coefficients, and again, I don't know how useful it is to actually look at individual coefficients here, but the prose sort of gives you the big message. There's a time trend towards increased emissions. So overall, states controlling for everything else just tended to increase their emissions over time. However, the strength of the environmental movement, when it's allowed to interact with that time trend, actually the interaction effect balances the overall time trend effect. So the stronger the environmental movement, the more the time trend effect for a particular state tends to disappear. Increased population, not surprisingly, increases emission. Increased employment increases emission. Affluence actually has no net effect on environmental impact once you control for those other things. The baseline differences in the state are generated by population. So these are the differences across states in 1990 are generated by population and environmentalism. So our conclusion, and then we do some robustness checks. So one of the ways we did the robustness checks was to put in the different political power variables one at a time, because we have limited numbers of degrees of freedom in the analysis, and see if they matter. So we looked at these measures of liberalism in the state that political sciences have developed, proportion of women in the legislature, the population unionized. None of them are significant when we control for the other variables. But one of you may say, but you didn't control for, and that's true, whatever it is you're thinking about. So Ken Frank, my colleague, who's co-author on this, has developed a method that I think is very useful, which is how powerful would a variable that we didn't include have to be to make our results go away, to make them go non-significant. And when we do this analysis, what we find is that the confounding variable that we didn't include, that you thought of and are going to go publish a paper showing that we're wrong with, would have to be 60% as powerful as population, which was one of the stronger variables in the whole model. Okay? So it would have to be, the thing we forgot has to be whopping powerful compared to the things that are already in the model to take away the effects we've already got. Or 46% of the effects of environmental movement strength, which was the kind of the key variable we were interested in theoretically, would have to be spurious before our model would become non-significant. So this is an approach that Ken has developed that lets us think through not just whether or not things are significant, but if we've misspecified the model, how bad is it? How powerful would the variable we forgot to put in have to be to lead us to a different substantive conclusion? And this indicates that these results actually are pretty powerful. They're not bulletproof. I mean, it's not 200% as strong as population to make our inference go away. But as things go, this is pretty powerful, fairly powerful inference. So we're fairly confident these are right. Okay, so the dominant measure in the analysis is environmentalism. So having a strong environmental movement that leads to, the way we measure that is people are getting elected to Congress who have strong environmental voting records. So that's an indication that people in the state care about the environment. That actually seems to have an effect moderating the drivers of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore leading to less emissions than would otherwise happen in a state. Liberalism, conservatism doesn't have any effect once you control for environmentalism. That's not to say that it wouldn't have an effect if we leave out environmentalism, but once you take account of environmentalism, liberalism, conservatism doesn't make effect. Ecofeminist theory, well, we didn't have a very strong measure of women's empowerment, so I don't want to say too much about that, but at least we didn't find anything. Labor unions, no effect. So let me just drop back again to the basic conclusion. So what we're showing here is that a form of politics, environmentalism, moderates the effects of population, affluence, labor force participation in driving greenhouse, and time trends in driving greenhouse gas emissions. So politics matters is sort of the conclusion here. Okay, we also did a thing with, so what drives environmentalism? And I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to say much about this, but we did a more traditional between and within effects, fixed effects and base effects, looking at what drives environmentalism. And some of the factors that didn't matter in directly affecting greenhouse gas emissions have indirect effects because they in turn shape whether or not a state has strong environmental politics. So scale of, I never want to ignore this, the scale of human activity matters. I mean, it's population and affluence and actually labor force participation that drives greenhouse gas emissions. But politics can moderate that to a substantial degree. Okay? And what this also says is that it seems to confirm Schwamm's argument that whether or not you get this straight line increasing environmental impacts forever or the ecological modernization theory tip-over effect, the inverted U, does seem to depend on politics. So that's Rachel's argument seems to be correct. Obviously, much more needs to be done to explore this in other ways. So what next? And I think this is my last slide, my last slide. We're also going to do this kind of analysis looking at human well-being and its drivers as part of this notion that sustainability is about both effects stress on the environment and human well-being. But we're also going to refine this analysis I just showed you. We're getting data, it's sort of in the works right now, on, we're trying to get at what strategies of environmentalism work. So we have data coming in on political protests, pro and anti-environmental protests within a state, lobbying, the state congressional delegation by environmental and anti-environmental groups, and the strength of what's called in the jargon the epistemic community, which is us. How strong is the environmental science community in this state? There's an argument in political science and international relations that one of the real major factors influencing countries to commit to environmental treaties is the strength of the environmental science community in that country. And so we want to test that as well. We also, this is sort of completely separate stuff, we have data from a representative sample of the state of Michigan on subjective well-being, and we want to do the same kind of contextual analysis to see if various factors in characteristics of where people live influence how their individual characteristics influence their subjective well-being. Well, there's several other things I'm working on. I'll leave those there. And I want to thank my many collaborators. They're responsible for whatever made sense in this, and I'm responsible for what was either wrong or unclear or stupid. This, by the way, is Lynn's last visit. This is Lynn Ostrom, her last visit to MSU. This is Jack. Some of you know Jack Liu's Center for Systems Integration and Sustainability. This is Wu Yang, who is the principal co-author on that study I presented just in sort of quick sketch about measuring use of ecosystem services at the household level, and then other collaborators, graduate students, and colleagues around the country. And with that, yes, I'll stop. I'm happy for any questions or comments or disparaging remarks.
So I'm curious, you use legislative, as the measure for connecting with greenhouse gas emissions, but there's an intermediary, which
Absolutely.
is the policymakers, and I could see an adaptation of Rachel's theory where you look at the relative ascendancy of regulatory organizations like the EPA or the Utah Department of Environmental Quality versus the sort of treadmill kinds of organizations
right.
like natural resources agencies, or and I'm wondering whether you would be able to do the same kind of exercise, but instead looking at what happens in the executive branch instead of in the legislative.
That would be really good to do. I spent a lot of time talking about data, and actually I think, and I'll give you credit for this, it's an interesting insight to look at the relative strength of agencies that are clearly environmental regulatory versus somehow developmental, if you will. But what we probably need is a PhD student who wants to do that for their dissertation to actually put together the data. Because one of the problems of doing cross-state comparisons is it is very complicated, for example, to compare, how could we measure that in Utah in a way that we could compare it with Michigan and do it over time, because that's essential for this. And I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but there wasn't any sort of off-the-shelf data we could do that with. And to be fair, for the expansion of looking at the environmental movement tactics that we're going to do, this is all data that's collected by other people at great labor, and they published on it and it made it available as databases that we're pulling in. We'll have to do some work with it. So I think that's one of the challenges, is there are things like that we can do, but for that one, which I think is an excellent idea, you'd have to have somebody who spent the time to think through exactly how you compare budgets, personnel, and sort of think through that and do it, but it would be a very interesting extension of those things. Yeah?
So there's a researcher at UC San Diego, Brad Werner, who taught at AGU a few years ago, pretty colorfully titled His Earth is Screwed, basically. But it was a look modeling coupled human environmental systems. His findings basically were that as a combination of our political and economic system, we've sort of removed barriers to large impact on environmental systems. We're very efficient at doing that. We get stuff from nature very easily, very quickly. And in all of his modeling, he found sort of one formulation that put the brakes on things. He had called it a friction term, and that was direct action movements.
Right.
Some civil disobedience, some
Right.
not. Some legal, some not illegal. But his basic conclusion from his studies was that sort of the only way you can stop massive environmental damage crossing full planetary boundaries was through direct action. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, in fact, if you consider demonstrations direct action, that's what we'll be testing in the next paper. That we'll have data on the demonstrations by environmental movement organizations and anti-environmental movement organizations for states over time, and we'll put it into this model and see if that's sort of unpacking, if you will, what this environmentalism thing means. And maybe it is direct action, and we'll have other measures as well, working through the system, so it's lobbying. The scientific community, those are the three that we have measures on that we'll be incorporating over. I hope we'll get this done by the end of the semester. I think it's a hypothesis. There is a literature in sociology on what makes social movements successful. The most famous book is called The Strategy of Social Protest by Bill Gamson, where he does this sample of social movement organizations across the whole history of the United States and then codes up their characteristics and codes up whether they were successful basically in persisting and actually achieving the goals that they stated. So it's really interesting, except that it was so labor intensive to do that because he had to dig through historical, or his research assistants had to dig through historical sources, that his sample size is 53. And somebody should really replicate that because it was very powerful at testing a whole series of theories about what strategies actually work to affect change. But he wasn't looking at environmental. There were a couple of environmental organizations in the sample, but it was this sort of random sample of ones. But I think we need to do that kind of work because people certainly make political arguments on one side of that or the other. You got to work within the system. No, you won't get anywhere. But as social scientists, well, those are hypotheses and we should be testing them. And people do to some extent. And for that one, at least within the context of U.S. states, we'll be doing that. Well, also, if we can get good measures over time, we'd like to use different dependent variables. But we've actually been a little stymied with that we haven't so far come upon a dependent variable that's a measure of stress on the environment that is reasonably well measured, that makes sense to do at the state level, for which we have comparable data for all states for at least 10 or 15 years. At first I thought, oh, there'll be lots of these. But, you know, I mean, one of the things was how much land is set away in parks. There are two problems. One is what a park means can be pretty variable across states. But the other problem with that is it doesn't vary that much. I mean, states do create new parks, but if you look at the variation over 10, 20, 30 years, the last 10, 20, 30 years, most states haven't changed the amount of parkland that much. Utah may be an exception because of the national parks. But so that's, this data challenge comes back again, that conceptually we know how to do it, but we may not have the data to be able to address that problem. Yeah?
So this sort of relates to something we discussed earlier, but I think this kind of carries on with what you were just referring to. But do you think that the production and consumption of animals might be a decent thing to factor in?
Yeah, the problem with, and this is the problem with all of this stuff, is with the production and consumption of animals that the production doesn't necessarily take place where the consumption does. Usually doesn't, in fact. But we certainly know from accepted wisdom and relatively modest amounts of analysis that animal agriculture has huge impacts on the environment. Now, I think the analysis that's been done is solid, but I'm always, whenever I have to make a statement about one of the things to be of concern is that increasing affluence in developing countries seems to lead to more meat consumption, which has substantial environmental impacts associated with it. I'm always surprised about how few actual peer-reviewed studies there are that actually show increasing affluence leads to more meat consumption. I think it's right. I'm just saying that there are only a couple of studies that actually look at that. So in any event, I think that would be an interesting thing to pursue. And I think overall, diet, food, including animal agriculture, is going to be one of the key things around sustainability over the next 10 or 15 years. So you see, we obviously know it's really important, and it's important in all sorts of subtle ways. There are analyses of food waste and the huge environmental impacts of food waste. So that's asking people to actually change their diet. It's just try not to have as much food waste in the system as we do now. The issue of changing diets in developing countries. Jack, I'm only marginally involved, but Jack is doing a study that's looking at the telecoupling of the soybean industry in the U.S., Brazil, and China, where the soybean industry in the U.S. has impacts mostly through nitrogen. Deforestation in Brazil, huge demand for soybeans in China. And so he's trying to look at sort of how all those three things are kind of moving together. Another example of sort of food-based impact. So in general, I think that it's a really critically important area, and it's also a very interesting area in terms of research and what kinds of questions we can ask. Yeah?
So I'm just curious.
Oh, sorry.
Affluence is not, shall we say, necessarily normally distributed. So
Absolutely not.
what, in your opinion, what effects would income inequality have on the strip hat model, in your opinion?
Oh, it's something that has been put in some applications of STIRPAT cross-nationally, and it's very, very important. Andrew Jorgensen, who's done a lot of this work, one of the most productive scholars in the area, has looked at this and said in fact, he has a whole line of research that's kind of ongoing right now. Papers coming out that shows that inequality very substantially exacerbates stress placed on the environment. We haven't done it, not because we don't think it's important, it's just we haven't gotten to that one yet. I mean, part of the technical issue with doing inequality is you have to think through what you mean by inequality. And there are a number of good measures of inequality, but you do have to think through which kind of inequality do I want to measure. You usually can't use them all at once because they're too collinear. But anyway, so there's a few technical challenges, but they're by no means insurmountable, and I think that's something that we're we're seeing. I mean, in the STRPAT literature, there's, at the cross-national level, there's lots of other stuff that's considered. There's analyses that show that countries that put a lot of money or people in the military tend to have much greater impact on the environment. As I mentioned, there's, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 peer-reviewed papers that use this approach, each looking at slightly different sets of variables or slightly different measures of environmental impact. So it's kind of it's a whole area. And one of the ways I approach my research is that if really good people are already doing it, I'm not going to be able to contribute much. So I try to go kind of off on these margins, like let's look at U.S. states, let's bring in this sort of political variable, let's use a different statistical methodology than people have been using to see if this sort of adds something to the discussion. But yeah, so anyway, inequality is clearly very important in this. Yeah.
What, in your opinion, would be a really good way to bolster environmentalism in communities, especially areas where income disparity is pretty high? How do you get somebody who earns X amount of dollars more than this person to care as much or the same amount? Is lower income tied to less care for the environment and vice versa invariably? Or?
Yeah, you see these surveys that conclude that, but here's the trick. If you ask somebody who's poor, what's the most important issue facing the nation? They'll say the economics. If you give them a list of issues and ask them to check off which of these is really important, where they don't have to choose among them, usually they give environment a pretty high score. So a little bit of this means, yeah, top priority is the economy because I'm poor, but I care about the environment too. And there's, right, Jennifer can back me up on this, there's evidence that poor countries are actually pretty high in environmental concern at the individual level. It's just, it's not necessarily the first thing people talk about for those reasons. So, and then I think you have to link environmental concerns to other sorts of justice concerns. But of course, as we see with Flint, I mean, there are still horrendous environmental justice problems in the U.S. And Flint is, of course, not unique. There are a lot of communities that have faced lead contamination in water, let alone other sorts of contaminants, and they tend to be poor and minority communities. So it's a sort of an ongoing issue. But I think in terms of activist strategy, I think there are a couple of key things, one of which is if you're an environmentalist and you want to organize, don't tell people things, ask people things. You know, kind of go into the communities and try to help with their problems, not come in and say, boy, you people ought to really be concerned about the environment. And so it has to be a bit emergent and a bit interactive, but you know, it persists. And it's been around forever. The environmental movement sometimes gets accused of being very elitist. And yet, if you trace the sort of new wave of the environmental movement to about 1970, the people who organized Earth Day, I don't mean Gaylord Nelson, who sort of decreed Earth Day, but the people who actually organized the teach-ins were mostly people who were veterans of the civil rights demonstrations in the South. And Environmental Action, which was the environmental organization that actually created Earth Day organizationally, it was called Environmental Teach-In Incorporated, Environmental Earth Day Incorporated. They changed their name to Environmental Action and became an environmental NGO. And they were always, in the 70s and 80s, always talking about environmental justice. So it's actually been around, and I think the accusation that environmental movements are sort of elitist, certainly there are some environmental organizations and some environmentalists that are elitist, but I don't think that's a reasonable characterization of the whole movement. It is sort of a caricature. But anyway. Yes? Oh, yes.
So speaking of the Flint, Michigan issue, I was wondering, so recently I found out that a researcher, a professor at Virginia Tech, Mark Edwards,
Yeah.
So he just spoke at the AG conference of 2,000 people and talked about he basically sacrificed his academic career in order to uncover some of the discrepancies in what the EPA and the mayor of Flint were saying about what was happening with the water quality. He uncovered a lot of that, but it ended up sort of diminishing his academic network. So I was wondering if you could speak about how to destigmatize some of that kind of work in academia.
Yeah, so I want to be really careful about talking about his case because I don't really know it, but I've never heard him in person, but I've heard writings and speeches he's given that I've listened to. So let me tell you another part of the story. The first person to raise concerns about Flint was one of my colleagues who's a pediatrician who is MSU medical school faculty member but who works in Flint. And Michigan has lead testing of children automatically because there's such a problem with lead contamination from paint. And she's the one who, I mean, I'm not trying to take anything away from him, but as far as I understand the history, she was the one who first said, whoa, what's going on here? Because some of the children I'm testing have off the charts lead levels. And she is seen at MSU as one of our greatest heroes. I mean, we just worship her. The university is, I'm sure she's going to get some major awards from the university. I'm inviting her to be one of the major speakers at we do a thing called Fate of the Earth every year, 2 big days of public talks. So, there's no diminishment. There is an issue. I mean, some people have said, well, you're the land grant. Why didn't you pick it up? Well, I think this applies to you too. We don't have the money to do routine monitoring to make sure that the state environmental agencies that are supposed to do routine monitoring are doing their job correctly. I mean, if you were a professor in civil and environmental engineering, we have lots of people who do work on toxics in water. But yeah, if I were department chair and one of them said, well, I'm just doing routine water monitoring all over the state, I'd say, wait a minute. Doesn't the DEQ do? No, it turns out the DEQ wasn't doing a very good job of that. But that's a separate issue. So I don't want to take away from him, but when I've heard him make these statements, I'm kind of wondering who his community is, because I don't see that at all with people. Again, there is this issue that it seems to be a lot of what he does is to go in and do sort of what, except in crises, is pretty routine analysis of water quality. And there is, and it is true that most faculty in universities would not be rewarded for that if it's redundant with what's already being done with state agencies. So, yeah. One thing, by the way, I like to point out when we're talking about Michigan cities, that Flint, Detroit, and every city in Michigan, up until about 15 years ago, I'm not sure on the exact dates, built into their budgets and their long-term capital investment strategies a return of state income tax from state government to the municipality. That was part of the financial system. And then a legislature came in and said, we're going to cut taxes. And they eliminated that. So all of a sudden, every city in the state of Michigan was faced with basically a 25% drop from one year to the next in their budgets. And that's part of what's driven the financial crisis in these cities, because then when you get a city like Flint or Detroit, where jobs are declining, et cetera, they had no way to make up for that. Whereas a city like Grand Rapids, it's pretty affluent overall, they were able to compensate that, but they went through some hard times too when there was this sudden drop in what had been a regular source of revenue that's sort of part of the contract of how the state gets financed. So I always like to defend Flint a little bit in terms of, because people say, well, they shouldn't have gone bankrupt and then they wouldn't have had these problems. Well, yeah, but there's some other things going on. But I also think it's clearly part of the Flint story that we were talking about community engagement. These city emergency managers are completely autonomous. They have to pay, and do in fact, as far as I can tell, in the case of Flint and Detroit, pay no attention whatsoever to the elected officials in the city. They have no legal obligation to. And what I know anecdotally from people who work in Flint and work in Detroit is that the managers have not. And so any concerns that might have been raised about water quality, or I don't want to get into all the details of exactly what happened. But there was sort of no mechanism for democratic redress or people to raise issues or concerns in that process. You have this sort of autocrat who controls the city. There's a lot of other stuff that went on, and in fact, I think there have already been a couple of people indicted for this, and probably more will be. But yeah, and the other thing I have to say about it is, and it is tragic, because these children will carry this problem with them for the rest of their lives. One of the things we're doing a lot of at MSU is working on dietary recommendations, because you can do a certain amount to clear the lead through, and I don't know the details of this, but through targeted diets. So a lot of people in the medical school are sort of working with Flint to try to figure out exactly what might work well and to try to get this to help remediate the problem a little bit. Anyway, Anything else? Thank you. This has been fun. This has been a great visit. Thank you.